Many of us have been closely watching the war in Ukraine and seeing how it's affected our prices for what we pay for many goods. And today we're taking a deeper look at the war and what has led up to it and what the future may hold with the help of an international policy expert with a unique perspective of growing up with war. Welcome to 91.9 Public Affairs. I'm Micah Terrell. I'm also here with APSU-TV. Dr. Vladimir Trapara joins us, and he's here in the studio. And we thank you so much, Dr. Trapara, for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation to the lovely Tennessee for the first time in my life.
Wow, so a lot of interesting things you've probably seen. We'll get to those in a little while, but first let's ask about you and your experience. So you've been with the the Institute of International Politics and Economics since 2011, and that's in Serbia. So please tell us how you got into that role and what you do in your role there.
Yes, I'm an international relations scholar from Serbia, a small but proud country in southeastern Europe. I've been working at the Institute of International Politics and Economics since 2011, and this institute is actually one of the oldest institutes in Europe for studying international relations, not just in Serbia and the Balkans. We deal with many international issues, have several subdivisions. One of them is subdivision which I am in charge of as the head of the Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies. So we study Euro-Atlantic area, personally me, U.S. foreign policy, but I also deal with Russia's foreign policy and U.S.-Russian relations, and I don't have a problem to tackle any hot topic in international relations, which is currently at the front line.
Right. Now, you grew up or you were born in Bosnia, and you've seen conflict firsthand. Tell us a little bit more about how that influenced you growing up and became part of an interest that you have now.
Yes, I was born in Bosnia, which is now a neighboring country to Serbia, but back then in 1982, they were part of the same country, Socialist Yugoslavia. And actually, I spent only a part of my early childhood there. And didn't witness the war firsthand. I'm speaking about war in Bosnia. But yes, I experienced it secondhand because my father fought in it on the side of Bosnian Serbs. And I lived in Serbia during it, which was under UN sanctions because of its role in Bosnian war. And my firsthand experience of war came only in 1999, when NATO bombed Serbia because of the events in Kosovo. So, and that moment in 1999 was actually the decisive moment for me when I decided to get an interest into politics, international relations, history, in order to try to explain why it happened to us. And I admit that so far for these 25 years, I haven't got a full answer, but I'm still looking for it.
And I'm sure you'll probably be digging more. And you got to share your research recently with Austin Peace students during a lecture. How was that, getting to talk with them?
Yeah, I shared with them my research into Russia's foreign policy and U.S.-Russian relations in particular, also tackling this Russo-Ukrainian war. I had this big lecture with the students and a smaller one for the faculty. And I think I managed to get them familiar with the basics about Russian foreign policy, but also to put some of my original stuff, more sophisticated stuff, to get into some nuances about Russia and U.S.-Russian relations. And I think the feedback was great, both by the students and the faculty.
Right, because it's a really complicated topic, I think, for a lot of people.
Every international relations topic is complicated.
Right.
And Russia and similar great U.S. and China, great powers, are mostly complicated.
Yes. Now, you've done a lot of research. I got to try to read through a lot of what you've done. You've had about 50 scientific papers and then 3 scientific monographs. And the Time of Reset, Russia and U.S. Relations, 2009 to 2012, and Russia's Wars, 1999 to 2019, and then Russia and Ukraine, Origins of a Tragedy. What lessons can we learn from those works that you worked on?
Well, unfortunately, most of these of my works are in Serbian, but I have several articles written in English, which could be found online, and these 3 scientific books are in Serbian. What lessons? Well, all these 3 books are very different because they were written in different periods. This time of reset you spoke about, I was starting to prepare material for it while a US-Russian reset, which was so far the most promising attempt of rapprochement of the 2 powers that happened between the presidents Medvedev and Obama. And later, actually, it failed. So until the moment I finished writing that book, I had to write it about a failed project, about a failed rapprochement. And then I went to writing about Russia's wars, motivated by Russia's intervention first in Ukraine and then in Syria. And in the end, February 2022 happened. And actually, at that moment, I was into preparing some other book about US foreign policy. But this war abruptly came out, so I had to abandon that about US foreign policy and get into writing about Russo-Ukrainian war.
And here we are, right? So,
and lessons are numerous. The biggest lesson is that during this whole period, US-Russian relations were in constant deterioration until we have this indirect war they wage against each other in Ukraine.
Right, and we'll talk more about that. And again, if you're just tuning in, this is Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV. I'm speaking with Dr. Vladimir Trapara, who is from the Institute of International Politics and Economics in Belgrade. Thank you again for talking about your research. Now, let's switch a little bit to the concept of hegemony, which again is something that a lot of people may not understand. So could you explain how this concept is often misunderstood in the area of policy?
This book I was preparing before Russo-Ukrainian war should have been about US hegemony. And there are many different definitions of hegemony, and the problem is that I disagree with most of them. I have my own definition. Because this majority of scholars speak of contemporary US as if it is already a world hegemon, which in my opinion is not true. In order to become a global hegemon, you have to eliminate the remaining independent great powers from the international system and thus transform this system from anarchic one into a hierarchic one, led from one center. And it never happened, actually. Today, besides the US, we have 2 other independent great powers, Russia and China. And as long as 2 of them do not want to accept American hegemony, America is not a hegemon. It is only a wannabe hegemon. So the country that leads hegemonic policy aimed at establishing such position in the world system.
And it looks like Russia and China are becoming sort of friends.
Yeah,
and so
they're getting closer and closer together in the face of this American hegemonism, yes.
So now speaking more about Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin, in your opinion, what do you think about what will influence his decision to eventually end the war in Ukraine?
Well, it is. He is not the only one upon whose decision it depends. On Russian side, yes, because he is a clear-cut autocrat. So it was his decision to get into this war. It would be his decision if he wanted to pull Russia out of it, but also other side should be asked, Ukrainians and political West. What I think should influence his possible decision to get out of this war is that at some moment he realizes that he achieved something at the battlefield that he could present to his public opinion as victory. Although objectively it would not be victory. I think Russia cannot win in Ukraine. Simply it is impossible because Western weapons that is supplied to Ukrainian army is of bigger quality than Russian ones.
And then what about sanctions? President Joe Biden has put more than 500 more sanctions. I think February was of this year. So how do you think those sanctions have affected Russia at all? And then what about a possible shift in the political and economic focus towards the East, for instance?
Yeah, sanctions are of course the parallel strategy. I got military means supplying military equipment and weapons to Ukraine, and on the other hand, sanctions against Russia aimed at exhausting its economy, exhausting its resources, but so far it hasn't proven effective. So it is very difficult to end the war by sanctions. But I think these Western sanctions have other long-term goal to exhaust Russia in some longer Cold War with the U.S. that will follow regardless of how Russo-Ukrainian war ends. And of course, these sanctions and cutting ties with the West forced Russia to turn to China, to rely on China, and to become, in a way, dependent on China, economically, of course, and maybe in the longer run, politically.
Mm-hmm. What do you, because again, I think back to the original Cold War where we had nuclear was the concern here. What do you think, and I know that's probably venturing a little bit militarily, but what do you think with China being basically a good friend, maybe even ally down the road, what there could be with Russia strength-wise that way?
You mean China will be stronger with Russia on its side, or
yes.
or the
vice
opposite?
versa, either way?
Yeah, well, of course, Russia with Chinese economic backing, and China possibly with Russian military, and I'll remind you that Russia is still officially counted as the second military power in the world. Yes, that would be a formidable coalition, but it is still not a clear coalition like NATO is. Mm. And there are many possible reasons for this, and one of them is that China wouldn't like to get involved in Russia's war in Ukraine, and possibly with the West, while on the other hand, Russia wouldn't like to get automatically involved in some China-US clash over Taiwan. So this is still not a full alliance, but close partnership it is.
It is, definitely. Now, many people have sort of just tuned out or basically almost ignored the war in Ukraine because it's been going on now for 2 years. But why should people here in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee area in the U.S., by extension, why should they care about what's going on in the Balkans?
Yeah, not in the Balkans, but in the Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. Yes. No. Well, it is not only the case here. You mentioned the Balkans. In Serbia, it is also the case. Mm-hmm. When the war between Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh erupted, and especially when Israelis attacked Hamas in Gaza, Russo-Ukrainian war suddenly disappeared from front pages. But it is still the hottest topic in international relations. So you in the US should think about this war, and not only about this war, but about Russian foreign policy, because Russia is still, as I said, military power number 2, one of the remaining 2 great powers besides the United States. The only state that has nuclear parity with the United States, and that can destroy not only the United States but the whole world. So you have to think about Russia, and also there is this ideological challenge from Russia. It is not the same as it was during the time of Soviet Union when there was a clear-cut ideological clash between capitalism And communism, this is something else. Because now Russia is trying to present itself as a defender of so-called Christian values, conservative values, which it thinks are compromised in the decadent West, as Putin and his associates like to put it. So this ideological challenge means that actually Russia doesn't have to attack the West militarily to gain something. It could attack it by propaganda, by ideology, by finding similar political movements throughout the West, in the US, in Europe, and to make some alliance with them. I think this is actually even a bigger challenge for the US, and I think your President Biden is aware of that. He showed that he was aware of that when he mentioned this inflection point in which the world is now, where there is a struggle between democracy and autocracy, not only between democratic and autocratic countries, but within democratic countries, between the forces that maybe would like to undermine democracy.
Right, and definitely. And speaking along those lines too, President Putin has claimed several times about the war in Ukraine that there's a need for denazification of Ukraine specifically, which is, it seems kind of weird. It's like President Zelensky is not, he's Jewish, but he's speaking more, he said, of demilitarization, denazification, and then, in his words, the neutralization as well, that he says those need to happen in order for there to be more peaceful relations there.
Well, a neutralization, he could have it. Mm-hmm. I mean, Ukraine was a neutral country in most of its existence as an independent state, but actually, it appeared that that Putin was not satisfied with it. Mm-hmm. He wanted whole Ukraine in his sphere of influence, in Russia's sphere of influence, integrated with Russia in Eurasian Economic Union. So Ukrainian neutrality doesn't satisfy him. Militarization, it could mean anything, but I suppose Putin thinks of Ukraine, which is militarily weak, so that it cannot endanger territories which Russia annexes in the process of this war. And denazification, when you mentioned Zelensky that he's a Jew, for Putin, everyone in Ukraine who is against Russia and who wants to distance himself from Russia is a Nazi, because he doesn't recognize Ukrainian autochthonous strive for independence, for separate identity. He sees it as some evil plot by some foreign powers, such as was a plot of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And now he sees the same in Western behavior, and he calls those Ukrainians that are in favor of the West Nazis.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting choice of words, I would say, right?
Well, interesting but understandable, because Russia and Putin are trying hard to legitimize Russia's role in international relations by calling upon this role of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Mm-hmm. This great victory in a great patriotic war against Nazism. Right. And they think that they lead that war now also, that Nazism was not defeated then and that they have to defeat it now. But when we look at this conservative ideology Putin adheres to, it is actually very similar to Nazism, and his behavior in Ukraine, taking Ukrainian territory by invoking that Russian-speaking people are in danger. It reminds much of how Hitler behaved in Czechoslovakia and Poland at the beginning of World War II.
Yeah, I was going to say the similarities between their ideologies are very
great similarities.
Very great, definitely. Now we went back into the 40s to talk about Hitler, but let's talk a little bit more recent. comparison between uprisings that have happened October 2000, President Milosevic in Serbia, and then in 2014, what happened with the President Yanukovych in Ukraine. I hope I said that right. So let's compare those uprisings and what can be learned from those too.
Well, it is relatively easy to compare it. Because uprising against Milosevic on the 5th of October 2000 was actually a defense of the electoral will of the people. Because there were presidential elections and people around Milosevic tried to steal them, or at least to postpone them. And people rose up, opposition rose up, supported by some countries in the West, and they defended this electoral will. And the similar thing happened in so-called color revolutions throughout post-Soviet states. Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, next year Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. Common thing for all these revolutions was defense of electoral will. But in 2014 in Ukraine, we didn't have that. There were no elections. Actually, democratically elected leader Yanukovych, regardless of his later behavior, was removed for power unconstitutionally. And at that moment, also this agreement he had with the opposition and with foreign leaders of France, Germany, and Poland was broken. So this wasn't either legal or legitimate. It was illegal, in a way, violent revolution against Yanukovych, and it provoked later Russia's response in annexing Crimea and supporting rebels in eastern parts of Ukraine, in Donbass.
Yeah, so it's interesting how those.
In my opinion, it shouldn't have happened that way, regardless of who Yanukovych was and what his decisions were. It just provoked Putin to act as he acted then.
And related to that, how, because again, Russia's had a role in those, and of course what happened after those. How about Russian and Serbian relations? How would you characterize those now? Some recent reports in Western media say it's sort of a balancing act, that you have Serbian government officials, they want to seek EU status. Meanwhile, though, they are making friends in Moscow and working to keep up those relations as well. So how would you?
It is very interesting and very complicated questions. I dealt very much with that. I could talk about that for a whole show, but I'll try to make it as simple as I can. Russia and Serbia are traditionally close states, not in the sense of the states, of the elites, but in the sense of the people. There is this notion of brotherhood between Serbs and Russians, of course stronger in Serbia. I can say that Serbs are actually the most Russophile people in the whole Europe, save for possibly Belarusians. And given that we today in Serbia have a populist autocrat, Aleksandar Vučić, in power, who has to legitimize his power from time to time in the elections that are neither free nor fair, but still he wants to have some kind of plebiscitary support by the people. He has to present himself as a kind of Russophile, so that he could get votes from the majority of Serbian people. But on the other hand, Serbia is firmly inside Western sphere of influence, and Serbia is under much bigger influence of the West than of Russia. And Vučić has to have this on his mind all the time, because if he would get too close to Russia, he could be punished for that by the West. He would be removed from power. Actually, Vučić was once against the West and against the membership of Serbia in the European Union. And then he realized he would never be allowed to come to power unless he changed his policy. So he made this 180% degree turn back in 2008 and became pro-European. And in a few years he came to power, and now he grips firmly on this power by this balancing between Russia and the West. But it is actually a balancing between public opinion in Serbia, who is pro-Russian, and the West, who has this physical influence in Serbia.
Very interesting how that works out. Thank you for explaining it in terms to understand. Now, what about in Serbia? Obviously, they're seeing more refugees from Ukraine coming in, as well as the Balkan region.
Not many of them to Serbia. There are some Ukrainians, but more in some other states, in Romania, Poland.
Right, in Romania.
Yeah.
Now, how's that affecting the economy of that area?
Yeah, but there are many Russians in Serbia, actually. Because Serbia is the only country in Europe which still has regular airline with Moscow, St. Petersburg, and some other Russian cities. And we have no visas with Russia, so Russian people can freely move to Serbia. And many of them moved to Serbia because either they couldn't do their jobs in Russia under sanctions, because they depended on financial transactions with the West, mainly IT experts. But many people also also left Russia because they disagreed with Putin, with his autocracy, with his decision to attack Ukraine and to avoid possible mobilization for the war. So many of them are now in Serbia, and most of them are hard critics of Putin. And it reminds me of the period between the two world wars after the October Revolution, when many people who were against the revolution came to what was then Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So their impact upon our society then was similar than the one we have today. Of course, it is in a way good for our economy because they bring money, but I think for the plain people it is not good because they increase prices with their money. So it's the double-edged.
Yeah, double-edged sword, definitely. In case you're just joining us, I'm Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV. Thank you so much for joining us. We're speaking with Dr. Vladimir Trapara. Thank you again for joining us. He's from the Institute of International Politics and Economics in Belgrade. Thank you for traveling all this way to speak with us. Now, based on your knowledge of the area and then the research that you've done, what do you think the Russian Federation's interests are in the Balkan area, the Middle East, and the Sahel region?
Yeah, it is also an interesting question. I will start with Sahel. I do not know much about that, but I see that Russian mercenaries were present there. That I think it is a lucrative business for Russia to be present there. I don't see any other geopolitical or economic motive other than this mercenary thing. And in the Middle East is the ground where Russia actually showed that it is still a great power, because in order to qualify as a great power, you have to prove that you're capable of waging wars outside your own region. So Middle East was a good ground for that because it is far from Russia. And there was this military base in Syria, in Tartus. Later they opened a new one in Hmeim. So I think the motive behind Russia's intervention into Syria is so that it could prove that it can have a foothold in a distant region, such as Middle East is, and to prove it is still a great power. And of course, there is this strategic partnership with Iran. Iran and Russia help each other a lot. We saw that Iranians' foothold also in the whole Middle East is bigger after Russia's intervention in Syria. And on the other hand, the Iranians sold these drones to Russia, which proved very effective in Ukrainian war. And you mentioned the Balkans. The Balkans is an interesting thing because once upon a time, during the time of Russian Empire and Soviet Union, Moscow was much more interested in the Balkans, its geopolitical game against Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, etc. But Russian Federation, this contemporary state, didn't show so big interest in Balkans. And it was such, I think, only until 2022. Because when this war erupted and when the West tried to isolate Russia, Serbia proved as the only country that still wanted to have good relations with Russia. And it is this good example of Russia Today, RT abbreviation. This is this global Russian television network, which has many franchises. And many journalists from Serbia for years asked them to make a franchise here in Serbia, in the Balkans. And they refused to do that. They didn't have interest to do that, but they did it in 2022 because the doors for RT were shut down in the whole Europe. And in order to still be present in Europe, they opened the franchise in Serbia. So this is why their interest in the Balkans increased recently, but they cannot do much about it. Their influence simply cannot be as big as the Western here because of the geography. Western countries, the Western sphere of influence is far more to the east from the Balkans.
And along those same lines, Western media, there seems to be just more of it, more, Western-based media, doing things, whereas in Russia, it seemed like there were many journalists who fled, especially after the Ukraine war, because they couldn't do their jobs like they needed to.
Yes. You speak of Western journalists who worked for RT there in Moscow. Yes.
Right,
yes,
exactly.
Right.
Now, how do you predict the war in Ukraine ending? What is sort of a time frame that you could see for that? And how do you think it will affect the development of Europe overall?
Well, prediction is always difficult. For example, I did not predict Russo-Ukrainian war. Until a few days ahead of it, I thought that Putin was bluffing by military buildup on Ukrainian borders. But this war happened. So now I don't dare to give some brave predictions, but I can talk about probability. And I think that probability is small of either side victory. I mean, in objective terms, victory. It is always possible that someone declares victory, although it is not, and to convince its public opinion that his side won. But objectively, I think the biggest probability how this ends in Ukraine is some kind of Korean scenario, some kind of a ceasefire without political solution at the current front line. And we will see when this will happen. I doubt it will happen this year, maybe the next one. First, both sides should get exhausted in this war of attrition so that they realize that continuation of the war doesn't pay off to them. And I really see this way because it is certain that Russia is stronger than Ukraine, but the West is stronger than Russia, and it helps Ukraine, and it won't allow Russia's victory at any cost, even if it would mean getting boots on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, because it seems like we have, if you would imagine hypothetically, you have very big Russia over here, very small Ukraine,
Yeah.
it seems like, but then like you said, in the background, there are the
biggest
friends behind
West,
Ukraine, that are
Yeah.
there to here's some more,
Yeah.
Patriot
That
missiles.
actually leads to this stalemate and Korean scenario.
Right, and I think you're right. I think it's just going to take some time. It
Yeah,
just seems
it'll take time, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's talk about Moldova. In your mind, in your judgment, how should the government of Moldova be worried about a possible Russian invasion? Because there's been talk about that. I've read some reports of it, but it sounds like they have at least a few high-profile leaders from Moldova meeting with Russian leaders. So it sounds like they're trying to perhaps maybe avoid something. What are you hearing, and what is your judgment about that right now?
Well, I think in Moldova, they had recently several changes of governments from pro-Russian to anti-Russian, and they all the time kept this neutrality, but they have this hot issue with Russia about Transnistria, which is de facto independent from Moldova and under Russia's protection. But I don't think Moldova should be afraid of some Russia's invasion unless Russia wins in Ukraine. So Russia is now physically cut off from Moldova and Transnistria. It should take Nikolaev and Odessa to get there. So until it happens, and I think it won't happen for the reason I mentioned, I think Moldova shouldn't be worried, but okay, hedging is always a good strategy. It has to find a way to be on good terms with Russia as much as it is possible, so that avoid provoking Russia in such an intervention, like Mikhail Saakashvili, once Georgian president, did in 2008. He allowed Russia to provoke him to attack South Ossetia, and then we saw what happened.
Definitely. And that leads me to my next question about America. And then should the West in America and, of course, other Western countries, Western Europe as well, should they be worried about Russia's seeking this neo-imperial aspirations that they have in the Ukraine war?
Yeah. Again, if Russia wins in Ukraine, it would be very bad for the West. Because I don't know how NATO could be credible protector of Baltic states then. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who are far smaller than Ukraine, with far more modest capacities to defend on their own against Russia. And imagine Russia attacks them after it wins in Ukraine. Will the US say, we won't send boots on the ground because it would mean the war with Russia and nuclear escalation? It says the same thing here in Ukraine. And the justification is that Ukraine is not part of NATO, so US is not obliged to defend it with boots on the ground. But it is only an excuse. We know that the reason is that the US fears nuclear escalation with Russia, but it will also fear that in the Baltics. This is why I think the US should stop Russia in Ukraine, because other dominoes will follow.
I was going to ask you, the dominoes will have the domino effect for sure. Now, what advice would you give to U.S. diplomatic leaders about how to proceed in the relationship with Ukraine at this point?
Under any circumstances, they mustn't allow Putin win in Ukraine, even if that meant boots on the ground. But when I say boots on the ground, I don't say they should fight Russians. They could just send their troops, Americans and their NATO allies, to areas in Ukraine where Russian troops are not present. And they should draw a line and say, okay, now Russians, it's your turn. Attack us if you dare. And Russians won't dare to attack for the same reason, fearing of nuclear escalation. I think this would be a good thing to check further Russian invasion into Ukraine, but it would have its price, and that price would be a de facto division of Ukraine. Because what is left, it would be left to Russians. But it would be temporary, And no one will recognize that. Let's recall when in 1940 Soviet Union annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the US never recognized that.
Right.
So it doesn't have to recognize anything now also.
Now, on the other side of the coin, what advice would you give to Russian Federation leaders about how to proceed in Ukraine?
To Russian Federation leaders, once Putin is removed from power and some new democratic leader is there, however it sounded as utopia, I would suggest them to leave Ukraine alone, to immediately pull out their troops to the line, to the front line, which was in February 2022, then to negotiate about reintegrating of Donbas into Ukraine with some wide autonomy, especially cultural autonomy and Russian language as the second official language. And about Crimea, I think that some compromise should be found, some concessions both on part of Ukraine and part of Russia. I think the best way would be to repeat the referendum there, but now a free and fair referendum, so that citizens of Crimea could decide whether they would want to remain in Russia or to go back to Ukraine. That is my opinion.
That is, and obviously that includes Putin, like you said, being
removed from power, because with him in power, all this is impossible.
Exactly. Now, if we were to think hypothetically about any normal relationship between Russia and European neighbors, Germany, etc., in the near future, would that be a possibility realistically with Putin in power or not?
I think not. I think not. European Union and its members distancing themselves from Russia more and more. They're distancing themselves in terms of energy supply. So they're doing this energy diversification, and it is successful so far. So they don't have to look for Russian friendship at any costs anymore. And I think Russia also looks to other side, looks to China, looks to some other parts of the world. But I hope after Putin, some new democratic government will naturally have to cooperate with Europe and vice versa.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, right, eventually, right. Now, if you're just joining us, I'm Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV. I'm speaking with Dr. Vladimir Trapara. And Dr. Vladimir Trapara, thank you so much for joining us. He's from the Institute of International Politics and Economics, and he's joining us here. So how do you think the world can possibly ever return to a peaceful state of being despite of or after the war in Ukraine?
Well, the world is certainly not as peaceful as it was 10 or 20 years ago, but is still not in the state of some all-out war, like it was during world wars. And I think that not only Russo-Ukrainian war decides about this. I consider that US-Chinese relations are actually the main axis of whole international relations. So whether the world will be peaceful in the following decades or not will mainly depend on their relations, about how this rivalry between the US and China will play out. For now, it is mostly economically, but it could possibly turn military, and then we all could get into problem.
How do you think the U.S. could improve relations with China?
With China? Well, I think given that for now China doesn't show any major signs of revisionism, that like the U.S. did with deploying military bases all around the world, forming military alliances such as NATO, such as Quad now, etc. I think that the U.S. should loosen this grip against China a bit, and not to try to make obstacles to its economic growth. It should devote itself more to cooperation with China, regardless of the fact that China grows bigger than the United States. I mean, there was a situation at the beginning of the 20th century when Great Britain was concerned by the fact that the US grew bigger economically than itself, but in the end, Britain reconciled itself with that. So why wouldn't the US and China lead the world together? Maybe China economically and the US militarily. Maybe it would be the winning combination, one of the winning combinations.
And some people might be like, well, wait a minute, China, they ideologically are, not that is a problem, but why China couldn't become democratic in the long run? If it is possible that Russia becomes democratic, maybe China could do it. And we must have on our minds that the US is not as democratic as it used to be. Freedom House says that since the time of Trump. There are many troubles here also with democracy. So this democracy-autocracy divide is not as sharp as it used to be. And that's a good point. I think a lot of people are seeing that obviously since 2001 we had the Patriot Act and a lot of freedoms that people took for granted were taken away. So definitely. Now, what about, you mentioned NATO. Let's talk about NATO for a second. NATO. How could NATO assist in a more peaceful cooperation between the Russian Federation and other countries?
I think now it doesn't have any chance of succeeding because Russia cooperated with NATO. At one time, Russia also wanted to join NATO, but as an equal partner with the United States. And this is why it failed, because the United States wanted Russia to join as one of many members. And then they, as a replacement for Russia's membership, made this NATO-Russia Council, but its activity is now frozen. Russia considers NATO its arch enemy, so I don't know what it could do to improve relations with Russia.
So it sounds like it might be too late for it to be effective at this point.
Yeah, of course.
Definitely. Now, what about Putin's estimate of the Ukrainian people, underestimate of their patriotism and how resilient they've been in the war so far, especially in the eastern areas that have some history of pro-Russian sympathies?
Yeah, it is natural because Putin thought Ukrainians were the same people as Russians and that they were deceived by their Nazi leaders and foreign powers, and that they would actually welcome Russian invading troops with flowers or something, but it didn't happen. It even didn't happen in eastern parts of Ukraine. Russian-speaking populations, even some ethnic Russians, took weapons in their hands to fight against Russia, because international relations are not only about ethnicity and cultural proximity, but about allegiance to one or another state. And we now see that many Russian-speaking Russians in Russia, they decided to leave because they disagree with Putin regime. So why would Ukrainians want to leave, to abandon its own, to give up on its independent Ukraine and live inside Russia, especially in Putin's Russia? So it was his biggest miscalculation, and one of the proofs that he made this decision about invasion alone, that he didn't listen to the people who knew something more about that.
And there are a lot of people like yourself who know that area very well.
There are many of them in Russia, but now they are silenced. I have many colleagues in Russia that I know, they cannot express their own opinions freely. They have to call this war a special military operation or something, although in their minds they disagree with that.
Yeah, and they know what it really is. Now, more on the war in Ukraine. It's stretching again on more than 2 years. What do you think Putin's intentions are at this point, and how far do you think he will go to get to his goals?
I think that he at least wants to conquer what is rest of Donbass, because the war started when Putin recognized the independent Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. So he couldn't say he won in Ukraine unless he had Donbass in his hands. And if he doesn't succeed in conquering what is rest of Kherson and Zaporozhye, he could say, okay, for now, let it be like this and proclaim victory. But in the longer run, I think he would like to have bigger portion of Ukrainian territory, and the rest of Ukraine is dysfunctional country. And in the longer run, he would like to see this Christian conservative values crusade all over Europe, so that at some point in all European countries, Russian-friendly parties and movements come to power, and Europe transforms itself to some kind of Russia's hegemonic sphere of influence, which would actually mean expelling the United States out. And it is clear from the recent Russia's foreign policy concept, where he divides Western countries into two groups. One of them are European continental, with whom he thinks he could get along at some point, and another group are Anglo-Saxon countries, so the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and Australia, and they are arch enemies. They have to only be removed from this Eurasian chessboard, as Zbigniew Brzezinski called it once upon a time.
Yeah, and how far do you think he would just keep trying to keep dividing those ones that he thinks might sway towards him? I mean, time-wise, it could be years. I mean, I guess as long as he's in power.
As long as he's alive, because I think he can't be removed from power unless he dies. I mean, there was this Prigozhin rebellion. We saw how it ended up. So at the moment, I don't think some promising democratic movement in Russia, at some point it may appear, but with Putin firmly in power, I think we would have to wait until he dies. I don't know what else I could answer to this question.
Yeah, no, we've talked about a lot, so that's great. Now, we have discussed quite a bit, and I wanted to ask you, what else did we not talk about that you wanted to address today?
Maybe something about U.S.-Serbian relations.
Yeah.
Relations between two our countries. I will tell you a story that many Americans maybe don't know, that actually in the whole Eastern Europe in the 80s of the last century, Serbs were actually most pro-Western, pro-American people. We liked U.S. culture very much, through movies, through music and all other things. And then when Yugoslavia broke up and war started, most of our people and our elites got disappointed in the United States, because Washington sided with our enemies in this war. So eventually they bombed us in 1999. So this is what bitters our relations now. But I think our relations could be improved if the U.S. could only slightly change its policy toward better understanding Serbs and what we are grieving about. That we feel a kind of injustice. We feel that all the others in the region are some kind, in some way, rewarded by the U.S., while only we are punished. And we are still being punished in Kosovo, which is internationally unrecognized, but there are pressures against our government to recognize Kosovo now. And we seek some compromise solutions. So if the U.S. could support some compromise solution in Kosovo, like there was a compromise solution in Bosnia with Dayton Accords, then I think our relations could be much, much better in the future.
Well, here's hoping that that happens, hopefully soon. We'll see
I hope so.
See if that happens. But thank you so much, Dr. Trapara, for coming by. Dr. Vladimir Trapara from the Institute of International Politics and Economics in Belgrade, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for your invitation once again.
Great. And I'm Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV.